Hi, I'm Ashley Gordon.
And I'm Kirk Kernut.
And this is Reading for the Rest of Us. And today is a special Reading for the Rest of Us because we are doing our very first ever Skype interview.
We're very fortunate to have with us all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, a native Montgomeryan, Ravi Howard, whose new novel, Driving the King, just came out. And we invited Ravi to be with us today for a very special reason. Ravi's going to be one of the 40 authors who will be appearing at the Alabama Book Festival on Saturday, April 11th. So just in about a month, we'll get to have the festival. How are you doing today, Ravi?
Great. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for being here. Tell us a little bit about your connection to Montgomery, since that's such a key to Driving the King.
Well, I was born in Montgomery. Grew up there primarily. I really enjoyed, the stories I would hear about Montgomery history, about civil rights history. So when I started writing, this became a story that I was really interested in kind of exploring, just the background of Nat Cole and the fact that he was born in Montgomery.
Okay.
So it gave me an opportunity to kind of come back and, research. So
Great, great. Well, we're going to talk about both Driving the King and your first novel, Like Trees Walking, because Ashley is we're both huge fans of that, but Ashley has prepped quite a bit on that novel.
Look forward to it.
Let me ask you, what is it about Nat King Cole that attracted you, that wanted you to sort of make him the center of this fictional universe?
I guess his voice was something that I always kind of associated with Christmas, reading, hearing the Christmas song, hearing Unforgettable, seeing some of his, some episodes of his television show. But I never really thought that much about his childhood. I guess growing up, I heard that saw that childhood house that's still in Montgomery that's, been restored. But that seemed kind of disconnected from, the fame that he eventually had. So I wanted to kind of explore what that early life might have been like, what he might have thought about when he kind of returned. So I think part of that was just kind of combining what I knew about his history from Montgomery with what I knew about the history that, I knew from his music as, this kind of pop icon and this jazz pianist.
Okay. Ashley, you had a question you wanted to ask Ravi.
Well, it's about this book as well as the first one, Like Trees Walking. You seem to have embraced a particular genre, which I read in one of the reviews as described as a fictional memoir. So you take in both cases real events and real people, and then you weave imaginary people around them. And I wondered, is that a good name for it, fictional memoir? Is that how you think of it? And what drew you to that particular type of fiction?
Well, it was interesting because I had never heard that term, fictional memoir, so it was kind of fascinating to hear and think about it. I think maybe as a writer and also a teacher, sometimes we talk about how you create memory for characters. You create a sense of backstory. So I guess we are kind of giving them a sense of memoir. There is an essay I like by Toni Morrison called The Site of Memory, which is about kind of imagining the memoirs. Or imagining the memories of particular characters, even historical characters as well as those that she fictionalizes. So I think that was something that always kind of had an impact on me. So even I think with our memories, we were participants in a particular moment, but as adults we are looking back and remembering it. So we are our own narrators and we are kind of characters in our personal history. So I think maybe in the fiction it kind of comes across in the same way. Obviously, I couldn't be there for the things that happened in Montgomery in the 1950s, but hearing them, they become a part of this collective memory. So maybe I wanted to put a character in that space and all that collective memory kind of filter it through one person. So maybe that's the approach I look for, when I'm writing.
Great. One of the things that I really enjoy about a novel like this is because it is fiction, you're able to play a lot with actual history. And most folks may not remember sort of the event that inspired the novel. But you actually take something that happened in 1956 and basically move it down from Birmingham to Montgomery and put it originally in the 40s as opposed to the 50s. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you first learned about that particular event with Nat King Cole, and then what are the sort of boundaries of, are you aware of any boundaries? Do you feel any boundaries to follow the historical record?
Well, I want to say I was a little bit older, much older when I heard about the attack on Nat Cole. I knew about his childhood home. I was probably maybe an adult when I first heard about that part of the story. But I think I had been kind of thinking about who he was in that history and that sense of him kind of never coming back to his hometown or coming back to his home state after the attack. So I wanted to let that be a jumping off for kind of what if, and maybe if that's kind of a thesis statement for this kind of writing, it would be what if.
Okay.
So I could take something that happened, like you said, in 1956 in Birmingham.
Uh-oh.
Historical might have been kind of similar. And I think if there's anything as far as boundaries, the way I look at it, especially with such an established kind of historical figure, the history of Nat Cole is kind of, well written and kind of well preserved in both his music, the video of his show also, and things that have been written about him in memoirs. So I felt like I had some room to play. And I guess if there's any kind of model, it would be maybe the jazz standard, any kind of standard from the American songbook that might have been, redone, rearranged by many other artists. I'll kind of see myself kind of working in that tradition. So how can you take something that has been kind of well known and maybe find your particular spin on it? So that's something that, I've kind of enjoyed kind of playing with as I've been writing. So I think I have a little bit more leeway with that part of the history because he's so well known and everything's, pretty much well established about the facts of his life.
Well, that's a wonderful metaphor. I
That's
really
gorgeous.
like that.
The idea of the riff on a familiar melody and jazz improvisation and weaving the two mediums, literature and music, together. That's wonderful. We'll probably use that one again around here, Ravi.
Okay, great. I guess maybe a part of that idea came from a Mobile writer, Albert Murray, who wrote so much about jazz history, and he, like, the sentences were always these kind of riffs. So I think because of that, I think maybe I felt, well, you can kind of play with it and have a little bit more leeway to experiment, just like the musicians he kind of wrote about, did when they were doing renditions or solos.
Well, one of the things that I really like about your idea of the what if is it brings a wonderful sense of reconciliation, I think, between Nat King Cole and Montgomery, because he never did come back to Alabama after that attack in the 50s. But you correct, in a sense, you correct that historical record, if we're allowed to say that. But one of the things I really admired about the book was that sense of reconciliation that comes through with him coming back here to perform. And I thought I noticed you mentioned Murray in your acknowledgments as being a big influence on you. So I thought that worked out really well as well.
Well, there's reconciliation for both characters. There's the idea of Nat King Cole coming back and our, as Montgomery, having a chance to rewrite the history, but also Nat, he comes back and he has his own moment of reconciliation, and he talks about the rewriting of history with Maddie and Marie and what it could have been and unfortunately what it wasn't. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've thought about, the rewriting of our own history? I think it's Anais Nin who said we write to live life twice.
Mm-hmm. That's a great quote.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think that's a good way to really think about it and look at it. I think the idea of kind of rewriting and living the life twice becomes important, because I guess if you're kind of revisiting a memory, even though you only kind of experienced it in an instant, the retelling of it probably goes on for years and years and years, or kind of coming back to it many times. So what was it like for him to come back? Would you change something? Would you not change something? So that sense of the contemplation, I think, is as important as the memory itself. So I guess if in fiction, or going back to what you said about the fictional memoir, if you are just doing a straight retelling of your history through a memory, which I think most people don't necessarily do, but kind of wrapped in that, there is the retelling of that moment plus any kind of commentary based on what you learned then, what you know now, and how that all kind of combines. So I think maybe the moment versus the memory of it kind of end up being combined. So that gives you a sense of maybe rewriting it and retelling it. So every time you kind of revisit a historical moment on various anniversaries, just like we saw the anniversary of Selma, the Selma to Montgomery March, what how is this retelling different than the one that might have been 25 years ago? So I think the memory kind of ages. So we have to kind of think about how the memory ages kind of in the mind or the experience of the storyteller.
Great, great.
And we'll get to Selma in a minute. I definitely have some questions about that. But this same idea of the retelling of stories. In Like Trees Walking, the idea of families telling stories, and there's even a character that I think all Southerners must know, of the one who's the family storyteller, and every time they get a little bit different, and the funny part is maybe a different funny part depending on who the audience is.
Right, right.
So storytelling definitely, and our personal stories run through both of the novels. But also what I loved about in Like Trees Walking, there is the family story. There is the telling of our own story and the 7 generations of why we're in this business and how we got in this business. And again, it's the collective slave narrative and the history of slaves in Alabama, but it is represented through the collective history of this family. How intentionally did you do that? Because I loved reading about the word Jubilee and why it originated, and there's a passage about that too we can talk about.
I think for me, the intent was to show the way that, I guess, stories are collected. I went to a conference not too long ago, and it talked about how an archive, before it gets into a library, in most cases it's maybe in a basement or family members are collecting it someplace in a file cabinet. So I think the history, before it becomes archival in the professional sense, it's kind of archived in that very personal, familial sense. So I wanted to show how, all those stories were being collected. Maybe the family business was a version of a collection of stories,
right,
kind of in a very kind of overt way to show, what the people are doing or what they have been doing. So that's one form of the history, but also what had been told to them over the years. And sometimes the collection is very personal or stylized, and like you say, in the way that it's being told and retold. Some things aren't available to the family members, so they have to kind of think about what was typical for that time. So the way that people who are maybe imperfect in their ability to collect all those aspects of their history take what they can and kind of combine it and hold on to it. So I wanted to show just how characters are doing that in the same way we as writers, as fiction writers, are trying to kind of do that as well.
So you mentioned Selma, and we just, to set the timeline for this, we just had the 50th anniversary of the march in Selma, and I was reading Like Trees Walking again through this weekend, so I was surrounded by the real living history. At the same time, there were other things being talked about in the news, like Ferguson, Missouri, and race relations has been tantamount to who we are as a country, and it's been very much front and center this week. And so while I'm reading Like Trees Walking, I am seeing the perspective of a young black man in South Alabama in 1981 at the time of a lynching. And I'll probably get choked up. It was very difficult to read because it was so painful, at the same time that it was so beautifully written. When all of these things are happening around us and are quite real and are not over. I hope I'm making sense. So my question is, what do you see as the role of literature in culture? Because you've very consciously chosen two points in our history in Alabama that highlight the challenge of race relations in this state. So that can't be accidental. So did you have a hope for what the books could do? One of the things I used to tell my students was, like in To Kill a Mockingbird, what Atticus says, you can't really know a man until you walk around in his skin. And what Like Trees Walking did was allow me to inhabit the skin of that young black boy, and that I otherwise couldn't have done. So talk a little bit, if you would, about what you see literature doing for us. What is its job? And what's your job as the writer?
I think as a writer, the subjects we often pick to tell the stories, and I think this is probably true in both books, are not necessarily the marquee names. A lot of times the marquee names are the people who are well known historically. Um, be If the storyteller is a historian or often a journalist, we kind of look for the news value in the story, or kind of the headline value, and who is kind of the most well-known person. I think we tend to start stories there, but I think as fiction writers, as poets, as documentarians, a lot of times we take people who are very often in the chorus or maybe on the outskirts of the historical moment. So many people in the civil rights movement were kind of anonymous. But as storytellers, we can take those kind of anonymous viewpoints, the people who just happen to have experienced the historical moment in addition to their, their personal narratives. How are they kind of dealing with both? So I think maybe part of it is to give a voice or to create characters among those who are often in the shadows of more famous folks, so we can kind of tell that story, because I think that story is much closer to the experience of the reader. So we can kind of look at history from that perspective. I think it's such a small kind of avenue to look at those folks who become kind of iconic as a result of the history. But I think my job as a writer is to kind of look at the folks who don't necessarily become well known. They suffer as much, or they do as much, or they have as many triumphs maybe, or they experience all those other things. So I want to find ways to kind of give those characters the microphone a little bit more. And we can see the historical figures in the background, but for the most part, characters who are kind of living their lives are kind of front and center in creative writing.
That's interesting that you mentioned sort of the observer participant type narrator, because I think that in Driving the King, most people that I talked to before they read the book assumed it was about Martin Luther King Jr. They did, even though Nat King Cole's picture's on the cover, they immediately went to that king. But MLK does make a cameo appearance in the book at one point. But really, this is the story of your narrator, who is that sort of observer to history, although he's deeply affected by it. And his name is Nat Weary. And when I first read that name, this is going to be the ultimate English teacher question about symbolism, because my mind went right to Langston Hughes, the Weary Blues, and the sort of the resonance that word weary and weariness has in the black blues tradition. I won't ask if that's intentional and if you meant it that way, because I think that sort of puts writers on the spot. But talk to us a little about what kind of person you wanted Nathaniel Weary to be.
I guess for me, and I guess first looking at his name, I think it's almost like a refrain. A name becomes a refrain through a story. So I don't know how many times I used it through the story, but think about how many times the reader has to hear it or the writer has to hear it. So I wanted to almost think about the way that it kind of kept bouncing and how it sounds. And I think that's one of those things that kind of the sense of lyricism kind of comes into play. How fiction sounds kind of gives us some similarities to poetry and songwriting. So that was one way I wanted to maybe look at Nat Weary when I was kind of building him as a character. How I wanted him to sound, maybe I wanted to look at those moments when Nat Cole was away from the microphone, how that kind of resonated, how his voice resonated, and how that was different from the Nat Cole that we heard kind of on records or on television when he was kind of wearing that icon status, or he was more of the MC kind of telling the story. So I wanted to see what that kind of behind the scenes voice was. So I wanted maybe Nat Weary to have more of a documentary feel. So he is someone who is talking, but they are kind of like away from that microphone. So maybe that was a big part of it, just to kind of have a more confessional nature to their conversations. I found a great radio interview. Jackie Robinson had a radio show. He was the host. He interviewed Nat Cole, and this was after they both had Nat Cole was off television, but Jackie Robinson had retired, and there was just kind of a conversational nature of their voice where they were ignoring the fact that they were on radio. They were just so honest in the way they were talking. So I wanted that kind of confessional nature to be part of it. Not talking as two famous folks, but the folks who they were when they were kind of away from the spotlight.
That's great. You mentioned Nat King Cole's TV show because that's an important element in the book, and it was also something that I really admired the degree of research that went into this, not only with Montgomery and the use of, you mentioned Kilby Prison at one point and the Empire Theater, different historical sites, Dexter Avenue, that exist locally for all of us, but you also have a lot about L.A., Los Angeles Capitol records, how records were made when Nat King Cole was at his peak. But come back to us and tell us a little bit about the story of Nat King Cole's TV show and what attracted you dramatically to making that one of the events in the novel.
Well, one of the reasons I think I took a little bit of license with the book is I wanted the Montgomery bus boycott, the 14 months of that, or roughly 14 months of that, to kind of coincide with the timing of Nat Cole's show, which was I think about 44 episodes that he had in all. So it was a little over a year. So it was about 13, 14 months that he was on the air. But he was really the first black star to have kind of a primetime show. There were other shows that were less prominent, some other kind of character comedies and whatnot. But I wanted to show the way that his show kind of paralleled what was going on in Montgomery, because a lot of people who were writing about entertainment were also a lot of black writers, black journalists who were writing about entertainment were also writing about civil rights, and they almost saw film and television as a public accommodation. So they wanted to say, well, how are black people being represented on television? So his show was as important as what was going on in Montgomery at the time, because he was kind of in that rare space, and people wanted him to be in that rare space, as long as possible. So that's one of the things that I saw, because there was always this kind of political, side or a civil rights element to him being on television. It was never just entertainment. And that kind of followed a lot of the movie roles that were going on in the 1950s. So I wanted to show, Hollywood or Black Hollywood at the time, and the parallels between that and what was going on in, Montgomery, Birmingham, Greensboro, or Little Rock, other places. So I think it was as important to people who were looking to see themselves on television, kind of as an escape to what was going on around them, but also just kind of as maybe a magnet to see what was possible.
Okay. Playing off that just a little bit, talk about your research process. When you're writing a book in which you basically describe a recording session, or you're describing the layout of Kilby Prison in the 1940s, how do you do it? Where do you go? Are you Googling these things, or are you going places? What's your research process?
A lot of it was going places. I went to New York and LA to the Museum of Radio and Television, because that was the only place where a lot of the episodes were for the Nat King Cole show. Oddly enough, by the time I finished the book, a lot of those episodes were available on iTunes. So, that kind of changed a lot. I started also at downtown at the Davis Theater in Montgomery. The folks there were nice enough to kind of show me around, because I just wanted to kind of get a feel for behind the stage at a big venue, to kind of see how it would feel. Also, the Ben Moore Hotel, I was given a tour by Mr. Davis, who owns the Ben Moore Hotel, because that's what the Centennial Hotel in the book is. So right. A lot of my process is just kind of being in those spaces, being able to kind of experience them. It's a little different going to LA, because a lot of the old venues have been torn down, but I did go to Hollywood and Vine, kind of walked around, kind of got a feel for what that neighborhood was like. I drove a lot in LA, trying to go from where Nat Cole's house is to Hollywood and Vine to Capitol Records, and then going from Nat Cole's house out to Alameda Avenue to go where the NBC studios were. So I just had to kind of experience it, and then looking at photographs so I would actually see how it looked during the time. Funny thing too with the Kilby Prison, the best research I found was a Stacy Keach movie called The Traveling Executioner. Really kind of odd film, but it was shot at Kilby Prison, so I got all this footage just from the B-roll of the movie, seeing what it looked like. And apparently they had to blow up the prison for the final scene of the movie, but apparently it didn't fall like they thought it was going to fall, so it kind of looked like ruins after that. And I kind of thought how interesting it was that I had research kind of just based on of film. You know, some other kind of creative work kind of ended up being the archive for what I needed. So,
Great.
So we've talked about history that you've taken advantage of and incorporated, and then these actual places. And that leads me to the very literary professor term of sense of place. I live in Fairhope, which is on the eastern shore of the Mobile Bay, and so I was delighted by the opening of Like Trees Walking because it describes a jubilee, which is we mentioned earlier, it's a phenomenon where when just the right things happen in temperature and wind, and ask any old sailor and they'll give you their version of how this happens, and the flounder and the crab and the shrimp, they beach themselves, and there's this amazing outpouring of community that just appears when everybody with their buckets and their spikes. And so you described that really wonderfully, and that was so much fun to read. There's a line where you talk about the runner of St. Augustine grass taking hold in the dirt. I mean, there are just moments when you beautifully capture what it's like to be in the South and to be Southern. And I wondered, what does that mean to you, being Southern? And I don't think, despite all of this, we talk about the fictional memoir and how well you captured the truth of those moments, there's another truth that seems to be outside of time, but very much in place. And do you know that you do that? Is that just part of being a Southern writer? Where does that fit?
One thing, I like about writing about your region or your home space is there's so many places I've never been, and I've only really experienced them through fiction. And that sense of detail in the landscape, I think, is really important, because even though we're tapping into things that have been experienced in other spaces, I think what really ties the story to the place is that sense of kind of knowing where the feet of the characters are. And a lot of times, they are kind of standing in those places that we've been. And I think it gives me a chance to maybe tap into childhood memories. So even though those things that we weren't using as traditional research, I wasn't maybe necessarily going to those spaces looking for a story, but I had been experiencing it my whole life. So I think that's one of the benefits of kind of writing about your regional space. And one thing I've loved about all of the writers I've read and how different it is to read about, writers from Mississippi. I have a lot of friends who write it from, the Appalachian perspective. So I get to kind of experience that landscape and all those aspects of Southernness, but I'm seeing, be it coastal South, the Gulf Coast, where the Low Country, the Upper South, kind of around the Mississippi River or what have you. It's that sense of region, I think, really helps to kind of give the color and the sharpness to the writing. And because we're building images kind of with the words, so I think that's the test. How many images, how much definition can you get? And I think that really starts at home, or kind of mining memories and also observation to kind of create that sense of what it's like to be in Fairhope, what's so different about Fairhope or Baldwin County than, any other place that might be 100 miles away or, even 20 miles away. So how specific can we get about that space that we build a story in?
Great. Well, thank you very much. Believe it or not, our 30 minutes are up. Ravi, we want to thank you for being our first ever Skype guest. And I want to remind everybody that Ravi and 39 other writers will be at the Alabama Book Festival in just about a month on April 11th, 2015. And we look forward to having you home and seeing you there. And on behalf of Ashley, I just want to say thank you and see you in our next episode.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Well, this
so
was
I'll see you at
great.
The festival.
Thank you so much, Ravi. It was wonderful. We could easily do another 30 minutes, no problem.
Oh, definitely. Give me a call. I love it.
Thanks so much. And we'll see you in April.
All right. Take care.